Now it is 4 p.m. on Thursday, October 18th, and this is the Salina Board of Zoning Appeals. And we don't normally do a formal roll call. Does our secretary want to take roll? We have the necessary quorum, and we shall proceed with approval of the minutes of the September 20th regular meeting. Any comments or a motion?
I would make a motion to approve the minutes of the July 19th meeting.
How about the September 20th?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're reading.
I'm reading off there.
The September 20th
September
minutes?
meeting, yes, excuse me. Yes, I'll correct that.
Okay. So we have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any other last chance for comments or corrections? There being none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, now to our new business, public hearing. First application is to be reviewed and presented by Dean, who is not here, and the applicant is not here. So I think we will go ahead and go with the second agenda item, application V18-13, filed by Central Kansas Foundation, requesting a variance to the C1 Restricted Business District sign regulations to allow one additional ground sign and 3 additional wall signs on the property located in the C1 district. The property is the subject of this sign ordinance. This sign variance application is legally described as all of lots 1, 2, 3, and the south 70 feet of Lot 4, all in Block 5 of the Northeast Industrial Park, Blocks 4 through 6, in addition to the City of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, addressed, thankfully, as 617 East Elm Street. So that's the former ComCare being rehabbed to become CKF.
Yes, thank you, Board. We're going to do things a little different than normal. I'm going to make an attempt at multitasking, which probably won't go ultra smooth, but just bear with me. This is a little bit more of a complex variance, and so I'm going to try to set the stage of the context of what we're dealing with and the history here. So the property we're dealing with is the former ComCare property at 617 Elm, and you can see that here on the aerial photo. It is located on Elm at the corner of Elm and Front, and oh, thank you, John. And right next to the river and Riverside Park. The property itself was part of the Northwest Industrial Park Urban Renewal Project and is part of the Northeast Industrial Park subdivision. The building that you see, the original construction was constructed in 1975. There have been multiple additions that have taken place since then, with the most recent being in January of 2002. In March of 2017, the Salina Regional Health Center moved from this facility to their new facility at 2090 South Ohio Street at the corner of Ohio and Belmont. The C1 sign regulations currently restrict properties to 1 ground sign. However, in 2006, there was a project in which a conflict in the code was identified, and that conflict of the code was that there were 2 different sections. One section allowed 1 ground sign per street frontage, and the C1 district limited the signage to just 1 ground sign. And so even though staff had always interpreted that to mean you can only have 1 ground sign, period, that conflict in the code and that general provision that seemed to reference that you could have a separate ground sign if you had a multiple street frontage was, it caused a text amendment which was eliminated in 2006. So today, you're allowed to have 1 ground sign, 1 pole sign, and up to 2 other signs in the C1 district. The Central Kansas Foundation for Alcohol and Chemical Dependency acquired this property in May and are currently in the process of remodeling it and getting it ready for their operations so they can move from their Ohio Street campus to this location. And in those preparations, Luminous Neon, who is the applicant on behalf of CKF, applied for a sign permit for multiple signs. And that's where this particular visual graphic is important. In fact, you may want to locate this in your staff report if you have it, just to keep it by your side so you can reference it as an index. You have the yellowish colors, so you have A, B, and C, which were the original signs. They were the ones that are preferred. And what I mean by that is when we met with Luminous Neon, we informed them that they could have one ground sign and up to 2 wall signs. And they wanted more than that, and staff indicated that if they wanted to have more, they would have to go through the variance process to get those approved. And if they wanted to let us know what their 3 preference signs were, the ones that they preferred, they could do that and we could permit those. So the yellow signs that you see, which are A here, and that's the ground sign at the corner of North Front Street and East Elm, B, which is a wall sign, and C, which is a wall sign, are their preferred signs. Those are the ones that they preferred the most, and those are the ones that Luminous Neon applied for and we were able to approve. In addition to that, there is a sign D and a sign E, which are small, what we call directional signs. So the sign code does have a provision where small directional signs, less than 5 square feet in area, that are simply meant to inform people of where to go, which doors to go in, where to park, things like that, are exempt from sign permit requirements. And so we are able to approve those signs without a sign permit. And so we'll get into what those specific signs look like here. So this is sign A, and this is the one that is at the corner of Front and Elm, and it's the ground sign, and this is the location of the previous ComCare sign. So this is the ground sign that has already been approved. This is sign B, which is a wall sign that identifies outpatient services for CKF addiction treatment, and it's a covered canopy on the west side of the property. You have sign C, which is their detox drop-off resident check-in and medical clinic, which is on the east side. And then you have a couple of small directional signs. This identifies the entrance to the driveway, and this identifies an exit only at that location. And again, those locations are here. So you have, again, the ground sign, the approved wall sign B, the approved wall sign C, and then the 2 exempted directional signs D and E. So that leaves us with the variance request, which the variance request is for the approval of an additional ground sign, which is F on the index sheet there, your master plan. G, which is a wall sign that faces the front or Elm Street. H, which faces Front Street. And I, which faces Elm, kind of on the side where the porte-cochere is on the east entry. So what that means is we've approved 3 signs, and CKF and Luminous Neon are seeking approval of an additional 4 signs, one of them being an additional ground sign and 3 of them being wall signs. So that's kind of the background, that's the nature of this request. Is that everybody on page so far? Yep. Okay. So the surrounding area, I'll pull up the zoning map here for you. I'll put a transparency on it just so you can kind of see through it a bit. So this is the CKF site, and you can see to the north you have some more pink area, and that's your C1 area. And then you have C1 area again to the west, and then you have R2 to the south, and some more residential in the way of Riverside Park to the east. So to the north, directly north where I've got the cursor on the map, you have Paula Fried, PhD office. And then to the north of that, you have WPM Pathology Lab. To the west, you have St. Francis Community Services. And then to the south, you have Residence 600 and a memory care facility that is being been approved for a conditional use permit and in line for construction at a later date. So when we look at the property and its unique qualities, the applicant states that the building on the property is set back 45 degrees. I'm going to take the zoning map off so we can see the aerial photo a little bit better. Sits 45 degrees and is set back from the intersection a fair distance. The applicant also states that customer needs clear identification from the street and in all directions to identify this facility for its patients and families, and that if CKF has additional monument signs directing people to detached drop-off driveway and the non-illuminated logo identification on each of the peaked roofs, it would help patrons identify which entrances to go into and where to park. And so I'm going to pull this up. This is Google Earth, so you can see what they're talking about when they say the peaks. So you have a peak here where they're proposing a sign. You have another peak facing Elm, and then you've got another peak on Front, which is over here facing Front Street. Staff agrees that the building is unique in the way that it sits angled at a 45-degree angle versus being parallel to either Front or Elm Street. And we also would agree with the applicant's argument that the property is uniquely large, as the property is almost 2.5 acres, which most C1 properties are well under an acre or less usually is what you find for a C1 property. So this is a larger property for a C1 property. However, ComCare has been operating from this facility for over 30 years, and they managed to get by with a ground sign and a couple of wall signs and small directional signs identifying entrances and where people need to go. And so one question that staff would have is additional information from the applicant on why the additional 3 wall signs and additional ground sign would be necessary, and why they couldn't enhance their signage with directional signage to help their patrons understand which driveways are which and where to go. Staff is always concerned when we're looking at a sign variance, and we're concerned about approving additional signs above the limitations of the C1 district without any compelling reasons that are truly unique to the property in question, as it could set an unfavorable precedent for future cases. So when we're looking at any type of sign variance, we want to really make sure that we hone in on what is unique about this property versus other properties, so that we don't unknowingly and unwittingly create a variance that sets a precedent that we may have negative feelings about later on. Looking at the adverse effects on the neighbors in the neighborhood, the applicant is proposing a small internal illuminated monument sign, and that is going to be sign F. And they believe it's less intrusive than a pole sign, which is currently allowed in the C1 district. So the C1 district does allow for 1 ground sign, 1 pole sign, and then 2 other signs, which in this case the 2 other signs have been elected to be wall signs. So that is a good point, and staff would agree that a ground sign is probably less intrusive on a neighborhood that has this type of character than a pole sign would be. The applicant also points out that the property is heavily wooded to the east, and there is a park, so there's substantial buffering between the subject property and the residential properties a little further to the east. Additionally, you have C1 properties to the north and to the west, and to the south. Even though you have residential properties, the uses of those properties are similar in that there's residential housing for elderly and a proposed memories care facility, which will have a quasi-commercial character to it when it's developed. So staff would agree with all of those points. The applicant also points out that the closest residential property is over 425 feet to the west, which is this distance here to the facility at St. Francis. Staff would also agree that a second ground sign would be less intrusive than a pole sign, and so that's something to consider when looking at this variance. One thing that we would request the applicant to explain or provide additional information on is why a second ground sign and the additional wall signs would be necessary. Not to repeat this over and over, but it is kind of a question that we do have among all of the, when we go through these criteria, as it seems a little bit redundant in that when we look at the variant signs, they all are CKF addiction treatment signs, which appear to identify the building and the facility, CKF, CKF. And so because we already have a ground sign, exactly like sign F at sign A location, here, staff would just want information as to why that isn't sufficient, because it does seem like the signage is unnecessarily redundant. I did do a comparison of the surrounding signage. If you want to look at that on page 6 in your staff report, there are a number of ground signs in the area. All of them do seem to be similar in character and size, with most of them being between 28 and 30 square feet. St. Francis's is a little bit smaller at 15 square feet, but all of them have no more than one ground sign, and the Qualified PhD directly to the north doesn't have any signage at all. So those properties are successfully identifying themselves without additional ground signs. Looking at a necessary hardship, the applicant states that this building, being set back from the street a far distance, is difficult to identify at the entrances, and more importantly, the detox drop-off entrance for patrons and patients of families during high stress and crisis times. Without the identification on the peaked areas of the building and the illuminated direction signs by the main drop-off entrances, the applicant believes that patients will have a difficult time finding the correct entrances, causing stress to those who need help. Staff believes that the signs that have already been permitted, which is the ground sign A and the wall signs B and C, sufficiently identify the building, and they also identify the drop-off areas. So if you look at the west one, it does say outpatient services and Pathfinder, so this would be the west drop-off. And then if you look at the east canopy, you're going to see that it does identify itself as a detox drop-off. So we feel like the entrances are noted on the wall signs, and that the real challenge is getting them in the correct driving aisle, or correct entrance rather, in the correct parking lot. And once they've identified that, then they can easily find the correct door. Looking at the effects on the public health, safety, and welfare, the applicant argues that the proposed signs will be small and intrusive signs that will simply identify and direct people to the correct entrances on the property. Staff agrees that all of the proposed signs that you see in the proposal are all under 32 square feet, which would fit within the 32-foot maximum limitation. And they would be fairly unobtrusive, and as you see in the graphics, they do look attractive, and they don't look out of scale with the building or the site. Again, this really probably comes down to whether or not the signage is unnecessary and the kind of precedent that we may be setting for other properties that are C1 in nature. Looking at the conformity to the general spirit of the regulations, the applicant says the property currently would be allowed to have a pole sign, and that they feel that the ground sign is more appropriate. Staff would agree with that. and they've noted that in the spirit of the current code, they have limited their signs to 32 square feet or less, which staff would also agree with. Staff would point out that the C1 restricted business zoning district is intended primarily to accommodate business and professional offices and to serve as a transition buffer between residential properties and more intense commercial activities, and that by doing that, it does have more restrictive limitations as to bulk standards, including the sign standards and height and limitations of signage. The C1 district is allowed to have 1 square feet of sign area per lineal foot of building frontage with no sign exceeding 32 square feet and no more than 3 total signs with the potential of a 4th pole sign. And the C3 district, as a comparison, allows up to 4 square feet per lineal foot of building frontage and does not have a limitation on the number of signs that a person could have. Staff believes that there is a good argument to be made for the size of the site. It is a much larger site than most C1 district properties. However, the proposed signs, G, H, and I, and F, do seem to be unnecessary and redundant and seem to be accomplishing what has already been accomplished with sign A. Staff is generally not supportive of granting sign variances because of the concerns about setting a precedent for future variance requests. Staff and previous boards and commissions have always strived to maintain a level playing field for boards or for property owners and businesses. Staff agrees that the CCAP property has some unique qualities, particularly the size of the site being much larger than most C1 properties, and the river channel buffering to the east with the Riverside Park there as well. We don't believe that the proposed signs would overwhelm the site because of the bulk, size, and nature of the existing building and the property. However, the proposed signs do seem to be redundant and unnecessary. So, with that, we do have a number of alternatives listed out for you on page 9. The board could approve the requested variances as requested with or without conditions that the findings of fact can be made. The board could approve a lesser sign variance. And what that means is, for an example, if you don't feel all of the signs that are being proposed, such as sign F, G, H, and I, if you don't feel all of them, F, G, H, and I, are appropriate, and you wanted to approve 1 or 2 or a combination thereof, whatever is appropriate you think, that's an option that you may have as well. And number 3, the board could postpone action if more information is needed. And number 4, they could deny the applicant's request if the findings of fact cannot be made to support the requested variance. A variance of this type should only be granted when there is uniqueness and unnecessary hardship. Unnecessary hardship means that reasonable use of the property cannot be made without the variance. Staff believes that this particular variance and this particular decision comes down to how the board views the applicant's arguments about the uniqueness of the property and what kind of hardship would result from the strict application of the C1 district. Staff would note that the BCA has historically been reluctant to approve sign variances because of the precedent they could set and the ramifications that could occur because of that. Now, in our staff recommendation, we do have a couple of options for you. It really comes down to how you feel about it. If the board finds that the applicant has not provided adequate justification for the additional signs being proposed, we would recommend that you deny the variance request. If you believe the applicant has proven sufficient justification for how the property is unique and distinguished from other C1 properties, we would recommend that the board elect alternative 2 with a lesser sign variance. So we wouldn't necessarily recommend that you approve all 3 wall signs and the ground sign, but maybe a combination of thereof, like 1 ground sign or 1 wall sign facing elm, something of that nature would be something that we think would be a reasonable compromise and could be justified based on the findings that we've provided. So we do have a number of findings for each of those selections. You'll find that there are a summary of findings that support the denial. There's 3 of those that we've listed, and there are a number of findings that support a lesser variance, and we have identified 6 potential suggested findings for that at the bottom of page 10 and the top of page 11. So with that, we will take any questions that you might have.
I don't have any.
Do you have questions from the board here? I have a general question about the C1 zone, and that is, since this building was potentially could have gone to other uses, but let's say you had a building like this or this building and split into 2 or 3 separate offices, are you still held to the very limited signs, the 1 per zoning lot or the 2 per zoning lot? Or can you split them by function of each component of the building if it were split?
It is by zoning lot. It's not by business. Some sign districts do have different limitations depending on the business. In other words, sometimes it's X amount of signs per business. In this case, it is X amount of signs per zoning lot.
So-
And a zoning lot, in this case, this would be 1 zoning lot.
Okay.
Now, could you potentially split it and have multiple zoning lots? It's possible. That would be really complicated to do. I'm not saying it's impossible. And there are properties that a single property or a single parcel could have multiple zoning lots, but that's a little more difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are no strip malls in C1 with
There are not.
4
In fact-
businesses? Okay.
In fact, you don't really have retail in C1. It's
Well,
more,
strip mall offices, strip offices, same
Yeah.
idea, the way you don't have any in C1 otherwise. Okay, thank you. Any,
I have a question.
okay.
Hi, good afternoon. In regard to hardship, I know in the initial application you stated that with the building being so far back from the street, it can sometimes be difficult to see the signage. However, in the diagram, the 2 directional signs are right by where 2 of the proposed wall signs are. Do those directional signs not currently meet your needs?
The small ones.
Yes.
They are entrance and exit, but they don't state what that business is. And like, let's see, sign C?
which sign are we, 1?
Okay, this is a question of staff or of the applicant. We haven't actually introduced the applicant, or asked for the applicant comments yet. But did we have any further questions for staff directly?
Sorry.
Okay. All right, now, the sponsor or the applicant would like to make a general statement, and then you could answer Mr. Garcia's question.
Megan, real quick, could you identify yourself?
Pardon?
I'm Megan Schaefer. I'm with Luminous
you.
Neon Signs and Corey Riggs. Lane and Shane from CCAT. Are you ready for, okay. In response to your question, those are just entrance exit signs. The permitted sign, which is, I have to look at my little sheet too, C, is facing the opposite direction. And so when you're coming in, traveling west, you may see those little signs. If there's no small monument sign there and no CKF on the building, you won't see that other sign until you're past those driveways. And we're trying to get them to come in these 2 driveways and not the second 2 sets, because those will lead to the residential areas. And that is where and you can speak for me if I don't say it right, but the residents that are in treatment and that they're trying to kind of sequester away from the actual drop-off area, and they don't want to disturb them. They don't want randomly them pulling up to the wrong one in a state of crisis, not reading the signs and not, you know what I mean? So although this is good for one direction, it's not for the other, and that's kind of where we're coming at, is that this building has so many facets that from certain directions you can't see all the signs, and so we're just trying to uniformly just label it as CKF so that they know that they are at the right place, and then direct them to the right driveway, so we don't disturb the people that are actually in treatment. Did that answer you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
question for the
For the applicant?
applicant. The signs G, H, and I appear to be just identifying CKF,
Yeah.
nothing more. Not really helping the person or their family get to a specific location
Yeah.
in the facility. Okay.
And they're
My
not
question is that correct?
illuminated. We didn't want to make them illuminated. We didn't want to make them really, obnoxious. We're just trying to, because of the angle of the property and because some signs can be seen from one side and not the other, or depending on where you're traveling from, we want to denote that it is actually CKF, you're in the right spot, and then that second monument would be enough to get everyone in the right driveway and avoid the first two driveways. And on the location H, if you were traveling south along North Front Street, if that is not there, the first sign you would see is straight up at the corner, because the other one is around on the other side of the canopy. So we want something especially coming from that direction so they can see CKF before they ever hit that corner, and they just realize that this is all one campus. It's pretty large, so.
That takes me to my second question. And my second question is, the address for this location is only on Elm Street, is that correct?
If it was rotated, this would be much similar, but it's not, so.
To
It
me, it
is the
looks-
only address.
Yeah, to me, it looks like when you drive down Elm Street, that it's obvious that is the main entrance to the building. I didn't see a problem with someone coming down Fourth, or at least me coming down Front Street, thinking that that was the main entrance. I didn't feel that way.
Okay.
And I know the building's turned, which might make it a little shifted, but I didn't really see that to be a problem. I thought it was pretty obvious to me that that was the main entrance on Elm Street.
Okay.
And I do agree that the extra signs helping the individuals find the specific drop-off points are necessary. It's these three that I don't really, I haven't been convinced yet that these three are needed. I don't
Right.
really understand the,
It's just, as you're going around it, the different angles, you just don't always see the signs.
what the person would be looking for, the entrance on Elm Street, if they've never been there.
Yes.
Not on Front
But they're also in crisis situations, so sometimes they're not clear. Sure, if you want.
The main entrance does not face Elm Street. The main entrance faces Front Street. The entrance that faces Elm Street, Lane Mangles, CKF, thank you all for serving on this board. The main entrance that faces Elm Street is
Get in
deceptive.
front of the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Microphone.
The main entrance that faces Elm Street is a little deceptive because it is not an entrance. That's an employee entrance. That only exists because fire code requires us to have an emergency egress there. Otherwise, that door would not be there. So if you are driving on Elm Street and you see G, which faces Elm Street, and you say, that's CKF, I'm going to pull in and enter there, where those of you who were ComCare patients would have gone to the lab, you're not going to be able to get in.
Who's
So-
done that?
Who has done?
Who has made that the, not the main entrance?
That would
You got
be,
the address of 617 Elm Street. Who decided that was not going to be the main entrance?
that would be our architect, Warren Edgar, architect.
Excuse me?
And that was not the main entrance when it was ComCare either.
Main entrance is B over there by the parking.
Yes, sir. And then, of course, I was where you went in to do an MRI, to do your
Thank you.
radiology. And as the gentleman stated, ComCare was able to make it work for many years the way they did it, but I went to the wrong door when I went to ComCare and had to be sent around. At 2 o'clock in the morning, it's going to be a whole different story. And we need to have F illuminated so people who are trying to come at 2 o'clock in the morning, including law enforcement or EMS, know that is the only 24-hour entrance.
Hello. In the application, you mentioned that you need those extra signage for those crisis situations. How often do those crisis situations, as you call it, happen a day?
Multiple times a day. We have staff at the hospital, so staff are coming over, or patients are coming from the hospital to CKF. We have patients coming from out of town from all over the state that arrive at CKF, so it's hard to necessarily quantify that. It's a 30-bed facility, so as you have those beds, varying from 22 patients all the way up to 30 on a regular basis, it just varies. Detoxification is an as-needed service available 24/7, where we don't turn patients away who qualify unless we're out of bed space. So it varies. I would say we have 3 to 5 detoxers in services on average per day right now, and they stay 3 to 5 days. So I guess just to give a little bit more consideration to the emergent cases versus the scheduled residential patients. May I mention something briefly about the signage?
Yes.
And my name's Shane Hudson. I'm CEO with CKF Addiction Treatment. Nice to meet all of you, and thank you for hearing our requests today. I just wanted to mention, as far as if I looked at this and I were trying to prioritize the signage, something that sticks out to me, if we can reference sign A, which is a monument sign on the corner, and the requested sign F, which is a monument sign where the detox residential and medical clinic would be. Actually, the pictures you see, those signs would not say exactly the same thing. Sign A would say CKF Addiction Treatment with outpatient and Pathfinder noted. They would not both say 24-hour detox residential medication clinic as seen here. This would actually be what sign F would say. So one of my concerns is that if a patient or a patient and family or EMS, people from out of town, et cetera, were traveling west and you see the entrance and exit signs, you wouldn't see this lit sign if it were not in existence to know that that's exactly where you need to go. Whereas the sign on the corner would not say 24-hour detox residential medical. That would add further confusion if both of those signs said the same thing, but they will not. So I just wanted to point out that consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't get to that point because I hadn't told you that had changed, so prior to today.
Ms. Schaefer also
Question
had,
to staff.
Ms. Schaefer also had some addendums to her application that she kind of wrote up in response to staff report that she wanted to walk you guys through. And I think Mr. Andrew has some handouts that we'll share with you as well that are copies of this.
May I ask a question of you first, though?
Yes.
How does this signage compare to, for example, what the emergency room would have at the hospital? Because they're saying that they need this so that these people in crisis, maybe even transferring from the hospital, police would bring these people here.
I don't. I mean, all I can tell you is it was a similar medical facility before, and that's really what we compared it to, since that was a apples-to-apples comparison with the same site. Now, I don't know how much signage the hospital has. I know most of our medical clinics don't have a lot of signage. They just identify themselves, usually with a simple wall sign, and then you're there, and then you walk in, and you look at the board and find out which floor you need to go on, depending on your doctor's office, and that's usually sufficient. But the hospital medical district is its own district, and I couldn't tell you how much signage off the top of my head that Salina Regional has on Santa Fe.
Okay, thank you.
The signs that Salina Regional have for the emergency room, the only one they have is on 8th Street, where Wheel Place used to be. That's now a private drive, and there's a sign there so that ambulances or vehicles that are entering from 8th Street know to turn at that turn to go to the emergency room, and then they have a wall sign on the entrance to the emergency room. But their sign that they have is what we would consider to be an off-premise directional sign. It's at the corner of 8th and what used to be Wheel Place, and it's to direct. There are a number of emergency vehicles that access that by 8th Street instead of Santa Fe.
Okay, thank you.
But also to that, as the flow of the road into the parking lot with the emergency set up at the hospital, they make it sort of to where you can't mess it up. There's really one entrance, and that's where you go to. So one sign would make sense, but if they have different needs for the crisis and versus the residential stay, it's kind of confusing where they're supposed to go compared to emergency room.
In response to some of the concerns that Dustin had, I wrote this response. He was worried that what the difference was between the clinical, what ComCare did before, and what this is now. And that was more of a clinical doctor, like he was describing, 9 to 5, open during the daytime. This is a 24-hour facility and has a little bit more of a crisis emergency scenario in it than just the clinic and every day going to the doctor. And so, and because it's so far set back, I did measure from where the signs would be in the peak, and I know that they're just identification, but we're putting them there because of the different angles. Most of the signs around that area, their monument signs are about 25 to 30 feet from the road, and sign I, if you measure from sign I all the way to the street, it's 156 feet from the road. Sign G, which is the one that would be the employee entrance, is 60 feet from the road. And then sign I, I'm sorry, the one on North Front is 156 from the one on Elm Street. So this one is 156 feet from here to here. This one is 60 feet, and this one is 136 from here to the road, visibility. So it's a large campus, and we want from all sides just to, first of all, identify what it is, and then with the corner, we'll identify that it's the campus and it's a drug treatment, and then at the other entrance, we will put the 24-hour detox. So no matter what direction they're coming from, and with the angles of the awnings, we'll have some signs on the awnings that are lit and clear, but from another direction. If you're coming, this is one of them. If you're traveling this direction on East Elm Street, if you see this sign here, you'll know that it's the campus. If we do not have this or this here, G or F, you're going to see this, and your tendency is to turn into one of these first two drives, because you're going to see that, and you're going straight back to where the residential area is, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So it's really paramount that we get this one here, so that no matter what direction, if you're traveling here, you see it right away, and you see CKF on the awning, and you pull right in. There is that sign here, but you can only see it coming from this direction. If you're coming this way, and this sign is here, it will spur you to go farther down the road, and then you can see this lighted sign right here, C. But because of the jut out, you can't see all of that traveling from that direction. So, and coming from this direction, like I said, this is the only mark of CKF that you would see traveling down the road this way until you hit this corner. So we're just trying with all of the ins and outs of the building for it to be seen and know that it's all part of one campus.
From that explanation, almost sounds better to take the sign G and sign A out completely,
Sign A.
to me. The one on the corner and the
Well,
one on
I
the...
would say that if we had to
and
make a
the one on the
compromise.
non-exit,
Yeah.
non-entrance, the
Yes.
exit-only gable.
I would say if there was a compromise, G is probably their, least important. If you get to that point where that's what you're weighing. It's not an entrance they use, it's an employee entrance, but I do feel like because that is the physical address, that it should have something on it. It's located at 617, and that is the physical door. And we can have something on the glass saying employee entrance, and, but hopefully the outside signs will direct them to the right place and not to that peak. And
Any further questions for the applicant?
Yeah, I just have one question. Looking at sign F, you said a couple different things that have got me confused. Is that sign lighted?
yes, that's the only one. That's the only one of the variants that we're proposing is lighted, and the ones on the building would not be lighted. They're just identification.
Is the sign A lighted?
Sign A is lighted. Those are the only two. And a pole sign is permitted there, but we just don't think a pole sign looks good in the with the neighborhood. So what we're really proposing is, instead of a pole sign, to have a monument sign instead, because we think it will fit more in with the residential area than a pole sign.
I agree.
We ready to come back to the board and
What staff would make a note on a pole sign, the height limit in this district is 8 feet, so they could have a pole sign, but it would be very specific and prescribed in that it'd have to be have clearance of at least 6 feet between the ground and the bottom of the sign, and could be no taller than 8 feet. So
it's just
you got 2 feet
It
to
would
work
look
with
like a
there.
T,
Yeah.
because we can't go taller than 8 feet. Yeah.
Okay. So are there any other comments from the public, interested citizens?
Did you have anything else you wanted to add with?
Are you the sponsors and the underlying actual CKF folks have anything else to offer at this moment? Any further questions for them from the board? Okay, so now we will take it back to the board, and what is your pleasure?
Okay, so the way I'm understanding this is signs B and C that are already permitted, they're using that instead of sign H and F instead of having the logo, they're having to use that for more of a directional because of the difference between the two sides of the building. Is that correct? They could, if they didn't have to use the sign for what they need to for B and C for information, they could instead have the logo on I and H.
Yeah,
So you're saying
we chose
remove
for-
signs B and C and erect
That's not what I'm recommending, but
I and H.
just so I understand it correctly,
That's an
with the
option.
wall, okay.
I
So-
will say that the applicant, when we met with them originally, that A, B, and C were their 3 priorities. Those were their top 3 signs.
Right,
So those are the
so-
ones that we processed and permitted.
I feel like because of that, they're having to use their sign allowance for more of a directional reason, because of the uniqueness of it. I think that gives it more of a reason for the additional logo signs, because they had to use where they would typically put a logo to use up on where to go
And
once
they're
you get
limited
there.
to 32 square foot, so we were really trying to utilize the copy more than the logo
Yeah.
on these, so that it communicated what we needed to communicate. Yeah.
So,
Any other comments?
To me, the 3 signs annotating CKF are not lighted. One of them is at the physical address, which is not even used as the entrance. And so in my mind, sign F is justified clearly because it's lighted, it identifies a 24-hour entrance. It also identifies what perhaps would be the more critical entrance because they're under stress, taking somebody there in a difficult situation. So I'm only convinced that sign F is needed at this point with all the answers to the questions that I've asked.
Sponsors wish to respond to that one more time, or is that a reasonably,
Of the ones that we are coming to
as
variance,
far
that
as
is,
the actual function of the facility once you're done with it and operating?
I feel like of the ones we are coming to variance, that is the most important, but I do feel that the other ones are not redundant, that they're important as well.
And staff would want to clarify that while we're talking about numbers of signs, we're really talking more about size of signs, because when this was occupied by ComCare, they kept adding facilities, and they kept adding entrances, and they added an imaging center, and they added radiology, and they added a lab entrance, and we worked with them to get signage for all of those locations to direct people to the lab and to the imaging center. The difference is directional signs don't require a permit if they're 5 square feet or less. And there's no permit required to put your address on your building. That's not considered to be a sign. So what we're talking about more is not necessarily the number of signs, because if these were true directional signs, 5 square feet or less, we wouldn't be here talking.
does anyone have a suggested resolution of this application? I'd like to make a comment and a motion.
I guess my only comment is I think the peaks look silly without a logo, so that's just from personal style preference. But I get where that could set a precedent, so.
Right, I get that. I could see how the peaks would look kind of funny without that there. Having trouble seeing where they're needed more so than F would be. I mean, F seems reasonable. Not that HG and I don't seem reasonable, but if you guys are gone from that building one day, that's 3 more signs somebody else has got to be taking down.
And they talked about the comparison between what the other properties nearby have, and we have more than double the square foot of property. So I feel like it's fair to ask for a few more wall signs because of the size of property as opposed to what's in that area. So that's why, if there's a combination of or a compromise, that's fine, but that's why we came to ask, just because of the size of the property. And
I guess the other thing staff would add is that we tried to provide a balanced approach and looked at this from findings that could support approval and findings that could support denial. You're certainly not limited to those, but it was a place to get you to start to think about it. And so you may have reasons that you want to generate of your own relating to how the building sits at an angle or its distance from the street or its size or those types of things. And if you've got thoughts along that line, we'll be happy to assist you with formulating that as a uniqueness finding. But what we tried to do is provide support for either action, and then you can review those and decide if you want some assistance with articulating other reasons.
For my fellow and lady board members, let me bring up a compromise. One of the issues that they mentioned was on Front Street, you can't really tell that it's CKF until you get to the corner. So if we allowed that sign to go on the arch there and then allowed sign F, we would have covered the 2 areas. Front Street, you could see the sign on the building, and you would see the electric sign A. And if you turn the corner, you would see the electric sign F, which points you to the emergency exit. I think that would be a good alternative. I don't know that this many signs is actually helpful in many cases, because the more signs you give, the more confused people can actually get. So I would just say that's 2 options that we would have.
If G is not to be used by the public at all, at the main big gable end, it almost makes more sense, it does make more sense to me to not identify it at all. But that identification where you want people to come and go.
And I think F really is essential, but I is a duplicate of what you would see with F, because F is lighted, it's a 24-hour sign. So I think you would see that. And I don't know that people would even look for a sign as high as the one would be on I. At least I wouldn't. If I saw the electric sign, that's my turn, I'm going in. I'm not looking at the peak of that side of the building to see if there's another logo
right.
there. So having said that, I make a motion that we close discussion and then move forward with a recommendation for the occupant.
What is the recommendation? I think, I'm probably ready to close discussion, and I don't think we need a motion for that, but we do need a motion for a resolution of the application.
Okay. I make a move that we approve sign F and sign H as outlined on the drawings provided by the facility, and measuring those 2 signs have been justified by the discussions with both the city and the people using the building, and we would limit it to only those two signs for the waiver.
Is there a second to that motion?
I second that.
Is there any further discussion of that motion? There being no discussion of that motion, then the motion to approve sign H and sign F as additional signs and, in effect, eliminate signs G and I. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Was that 3 ayes? I better hold up hands. I missed them.
I did.
Okay, that was unanimous. So the motion passes in that as made, and we look forward to seeing a very clear sign F where you really want people to turn in, and the other signs being sufficient to find your complex in the future.
And we just want to clarify for the applicant and for the board, it doesn't mean that signs could not go there. They would just have to be under the square footage limitation to be directional signs. So
Yes.
that doesn't mean they can't be a directional sign there. It's just that it would have to be 5 square feet or less.
Thank you.
Now, I believe we're ready to move back to the first application on the agenda. That's application V18-12, filed by Jonathan Madison, requesting a rear yard setback variance of 14.5 feet from 25 feet to 10.5 feet, and a side yard setback variance of 3.75 feet from 7.5 feet to a net of, again, of 3.75 feet to allow an existing detached garage building to be converted into a residential dwelling on property legally described as Lot 18, Block 14 of the Pacific Addition to the City of Salina, Saline County, Kansas, and addressed at 715 North 7th Street. Staff reports first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are faced with a situation here where we had a property that had a dilapidated dwelling that really wasn't fit to be resided in anymore, and there was a need to have that demolished. And our usual requirement is when there is a demolition permit on a residential property, that demolition would include the dwelling and all outbuildings associated with that, because you cannot have a storage shed or a workshop or a garage on a residential lot unless it is accessory to a dwelling. So we had a situation where we had a home that was in poor condition and a more recently built garage structure that was in good condition. And so what happened was we allowed the house to be torn down, and then we entered into a compliance agreement with the owner, whereby the owner agreed that they would either take steps to build back a new dwelling on the lot, or if that was not done within 180 days, then the lot would be cleared. But we also pointed out on page 3 of your report there, all the options available included removing the garage from the lot, which would conform with the ordinance, construct a new dwelling in front of the garage, sell or donate the property to a party interested in constructing a new dwelling, or the fourth option, converting the existing Morton building into a dwelling unit. That is the option that was chosen. The applicant submitted an application to convert that building into a dwelling unit by adding windows, a kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, and laundry room. We reviewed those plans, and unfortunately, because the building was originally constructed as an accessory building and not as a primary dwelling, its setbacks where it's located don't conform with the requirements for a principal dwelling. So this application has been filed requesting 2 variances, one relating to the rear yard and one relating to the side yard, to allow that existing detached garage to be converted into a residential dwelling. And so this comes before you where, in the opinion of staff, the best solution to having any viable use of this property is to allow that existing Morton building to remain and to allow it to be converted to an appropriate and safe dwelling unit that would provide safe and suitable housing for the owner. So the question before you today is whether you feel like the applicant has provided sufficient justification for being allowed to convert this building, the garage, to a dwelling unit, and whether that conversion would have any negative impact on surrounding properties. So we did send notice of this application out to all the adjacent properties. We did not receive any feedback from any of the neighbors as a staff. I believe the applicant has talked or visited with some of his or all of his neighbors, and that could be a reason why staff didn't hear from any of them directly. But your options in this case would be to approve the side and rear yard setback variances as requested. You could postpone action if you think staff or the applicant needs to provide you with additional information to allow you to reach a decision, or you could deny the applicant's request if you don't think the findings could be made. But as we have provided you with copies of what the dwelling on this property was previously, and at this point we believe removing or tearing down the existing building would be an economic waste, and conversion of the building to a dwelling should not be noticeable to neighboring property owners. And because the applicant's proposing to use a portion of the building as an attached garage, that reduces the likelihood of another garage needing to be built on the property. And so if you were to deny this request, we just want the board to understand that the building would have to be removed from the property. We don't see rezoning this or trying to make it a commercial venture or use would be a viable option, is because the Planning Commission had already reviewed this and they were not supportive of a zoning change to allow this to be used as a commercial building or commercial storage building. So we think that absent the ability or willingness to construct a new dwelling back on the property, that this is the best option and it's the best means of providing a safe and suitable dwelling on this lot. So that we'd be open to any questions that you have. Otherwise, we can hear from the applicant.
Do you have any questions?
So,
I have one short question myself. You do?
yes.
Go ahead.
So if this didn't have the two setback issues, would you have already approved this and it's...
We would have already approved that. There was a couple things relating to building code and clarifications of things but absent the setback issues, converting this into a dwelling is a permissible use of the property. And Salina does not have any codes that say what a dwelling has to look like. It just has codes of what a dwelling has to entail. And a dwelling has to have utilities, and it has to have running water and sewer, and it has to have a kitchen, and it has to have restrooms and a safe sleeping space with windows. So if you can meet all those requirements, your building can be a dwelling.
Got it.
My question's the long-term one. Since the lot's zoned R2, would it be possible either for the present owner or some future owner to again remodel this structure, maybe have to take the garage out, and put a second dwelling attached to it in front on the same lot at some future date?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Because primarily it's zoned R2 not to promote duplex or townhome use, but the R2 has smaller lot size and some other, a lot of our older areas with smaller lots are zoned R2 because of their lot size, not so much to promote conversion to duplexes. But if this became a duplex, then the primary impact would be that you would have to provide 4 off-street parking spaces for the 2 residences instead of 2 spaces for the 1.
Okay, any other questions of staff, for staff? Mr. Madison, would you like to make a comment? Please come to the microphone and identify yourself.
Josh Madison, not really. I hope it goes through. That's my only comment. I don't really know what else.
Do you have any questions for Mr. Madison then, from the board?
No.
Okay. Well, then, there are no other interested citizens in the room, so, board, what's your pleasure? We need to do something with this application.
Mr. Chairman, I would make a motion that we approve, as per staff recommendation, the applicant's request.
I second it.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the application as presented. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Were there any opposed? There being none, another unanimous approval. Thank you for your participation in the system.
Thank you.
Anything else for unfinished or other business at this hour?
We would just let you know that we do have an application filed for your November meeting, and there is a vacant lot, or a recently vacant lot, that's at the corner of North 13th and Ash, and there was a rather large house on that lot that was torn down, and being that it's a large lot, we have an owner who has purchased it, and they're wanting to do a lot split and construct 2 houses back where there was one. And to do that, they have 1 setback and 1 lot size variance that they have filed to allow that split to occur, to allow 2 houses to go back. And while they are requesting the lot size variance, as we looked at a number of the lots in the vicinity, there are quite a number of lots in that area that are less than 6,000 square feet, but we'll provide all that information to you, but that will be on your November agenda, so we will be meeting next month.
Okay, and that's what day of the month? I can't get a calendar to pop up in front of me. That will be?
Be the 15th of November, according to Crystal.
The 15th, okay.
That's the 3rd Thursday.
Until then, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.